US and Iran have tentatively reached a deal that offers a framework to end the conflict in the Middle East. By comparing and contrasting international sanctions regimes on Iran and North Korea, we can better understand how these states adapt to pressure, where their strategies intersect, and what the future holds for counter-proliferation. Here to help us understand all of this is an expert with extensive experience working on sanctions-related issues on both countries. Dr. Jonathan Brewer is a visiting professor at King's College London, carrying out research with the Alpha Project on questions of proliferation and the financing of proliferation. He was acting coordinator of the UN panel of experts on North Korea and financial expert of the UN panel on Iran. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Before we jump into the discussion, the Korea Society would like to thank the Korea Foundation, our corporate sponsors, and individual members for their generous support, which has made this program possible. If you enjoy our programming, please head over to koreasociety.org to learn more about ways you can join our community. With that, I'll turn it over to the moderator for today's discussion, Jonathan Corrado.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thanks for everyone joining us, and thanks to everyone watching online. Certainly thank you very much to you, Dr. Jonathan Brewer, for joining us today. Thank you. And you've sacrificed watching England play a World Cup match, so that's quite nice.
They weren't doing very well.
Perhaps we need to. And, you know, by stroke of good fortune, this has just been released. It's the new 14-point agreement, tentative agreement set out between the United States and Iran, and it lays out some interesting things. This happened just a couple of hours ago, so the powers that be give us a few minutes to prepare here, so that's kind of So it sets out a framework for follow-up negotiations to be concluded within 60 days. There are provisions to end the blockade, to set up a $300 billion reconstruction fund, to terminate all sanctions, and it contains Iran's commitment to not procure or develop nuclear weapons. So, with many of the details still to be hashed out, I wanted to turn it over to you for your first blush opinion about what you've heard thus far.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. So, as you said 2 hours ago. So it's good that there is some agreement which is going to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. This is a memorandum of understanding which will be signed on Friday, and one assumes it's not going to change before Friday. But as you were saying, Jonathan, it commits the Iranians to lifting their blockade on the Straits of Hormuz. It commits the US to lifting their blockade on Iranian ports. It also says that within 60 days there will be an agreement signed which will address some of the wider issues surrounding Iran's nuclear program, for example, and the issues surrounding US sanctions on Iran. There is a reference to the Security Council sanctions that will be lifted as part of the final agreement. And the agreement as a whole will be approved by the Security Council. And all those, I think, are very interesting. And if within 60 days we can indeed reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear program, that would be very good indeed. I mean, when you think back to the JCPOA, however, it's not clear just how far forward we've moved since then. What this agreement does is it reopens the Straits of Hormuz, very important regionally, but it still leads to future negotiations the issue of Iran's nuclear program, which was the issue that was part of the JCPOA. And the JCPOA did actually reach an agreement on the nuclear program. I remember I was working with the Iran Sanctions panel at the time, and it seemed to me that the JCPOA, which was approved in 2015, was perhaps not an ideal solution, because it was quite short term. It has left a series of restrictions on Iran's program, which were all going to be lifted after 10 years, and the Iranians got a very long time scale. But nevertheless, it didn't seem to me that there was a viable alternative at that time. There was no scope for future, for another round of Security Council sanctions. So it seemed to me JCPOA was best that was available. When we look at the current situation, it seems to me we sort of step back from the JCPOA. So that issue, how do you reach agreement with Iran on this nuclear program is going to be, I think, very difficult to address. Of course, Iran is very reluctant to accept further restrictions over and above its safeguards agreement with the IAEA. Of course, the IAEA will say, well, Iran, you're not actually implementing your safeguards agreement because I don't believe there are any inspectors in Iran at the moment. They were expelled following the attacks last year on Iran's nuclear installations. So that's an issue. There's another very interesting issue that will have to be addressed, which is what happens to the enriched uranium that Iran has been accumulating and that was destroyed or very badly disrupted during the airstrikes last year. And that strikes me as being really quite a difficult issue to address. Much of this stuff will be, it's quite highly enriched, some of it. Much of it will be buried under rubble. How do you actually get at it? And that will be an issue for the International Atomic Energy Agency experts to sort out. So the IAEA has got to be part of this process. It's going to be agreed in 60 days.
So what do you do with that uranium? Do you have to downblend it? How do you prevent it from being weaponized?
Well, to prevent it being weaponized, you'd have to make sure that you've identified all the enriched uranium and you've shipped it elsewhere. Will the Iranians allow you to do that? I don't know.
Fantastic. So I want to back up for a second and talk about your personal experience. And maybe this is because of your good karma or your bad karma, but you had been given the really interesting position of serving on sanctions panels on both North Korea and Iran. I don't know if there's anybody else that has quite had that experience, and during two very interesting tenures in both cases. So can you just kind of compare and contrast your personal experience working on those panels?
I'm very lucky actually. I have to say. I joined the Iran panel when it was set up at the end of 2010. I was previously living in London. I came out to New York then. I had worked in the UK Foreign Service before then. I just retired. I had worked on proliferation issues in the UK Foreign Service, and so when the UK needed to nominate somebody for that panel, I was an easy fit for them. I think one of the things so you come out, you worked in a state foreign service, you come out, you work in the UN environment, and that's quite a change. I mean, in London, when you go into the office, you're dealing with colleagues who are more or less facing the same direction, more or less. At the UN, though, you are dealing with colleagues who are all looking at things from a different point of view and facing in different directions. And so one of the big changes, of course, was learning to work with people from very different backgrounds, very different ideological points of view, different technical experiences, which I think actually is really stimulating, really interesting. And I think if you have an opportunity to work on one of these sanctions panels, I would grab it because it's a very enriching experience. One of the things that there were 8 of us on the panel. One of the things that the UN wanted us to do early on was to decide which part of the sanctions requirements were we going to be responsible for, and people took various parts. One person was a missile expert, one was a nuclear expert. Nobody wanted to be the financial expert, and I said, okay, I'll be the financial expert, never having done anything in finance before. But it was actually very interesting because financial sanctions were an important part of the Security Council requirements on Iran. And so this was a relatively new field that one could explore and develop some ideas and standards. And you could talk to member states about how they looked at the issues. Most member states found financial sanctions very, very difficult to deal with. And you could also talk to the private sector about how they were implementing sanctions. And so that was very, very, very interesting, very stimulating. There's another aspect of working on the Iran panel, and that was that we produced one report a year. And we conducted a lot of inspections of interdicted shipments of prohibited materials. So we would produce reports on those for the committee, but we produced one annual report for the Security Council a year, and negotiating that report was an eye-opening experience. We had to agree it by consensus, and we had some very lengthy, detailed, not very good-tempered discussions going on late at night. But we got 4 reports out. We actually produced 5 reports, but one was vetoed by a member of the Security Council, so it never appeared as a UN document. Then the...
Shall they remain nameless?
It'll remain nameless, so you might have to guess very well. So that was the Iran panel, and a really fascinating experience it was. And then the North Korea panel, I actually only worked for that panel for 10 months. And it was I joined the panel at a very different stage. So I joined the Iran panel when it started. The North Korea panel had been going on for about 15 years when I joined. So there's a sort of set pattern of activity. We produced 2 reports a year, which meant that there was actually rather little time to travel and talk to member states about how they were implementing North Korea sanctions and about shipments that might have been interdicted. And I don't think, in fact, there were any invitations to conduct inspections when I was at the North Korea panel. We had this process of agreeing 2 reports a year, and the experience of trying to get everybody to agree the wording of the report was pretty grueling actually, because everybody had their own point of view, and we also at that point had quite a word limit placed on us by the UN. So that the drafting process involved not just selecting the material, but making sure it didn't exceed the word count. So different from that point of view. But I think the really important point about these panels is because they are Security Council mandated bodies. The reports have to be agreed by everybody on the panel. So you have the P5 plus 2 or 3 others, and that gives the reports a credibility and a validity, which is extremely valuable. Because particularly with the North Korean reports, large numbers of them, very lengthy, a lot of material in them, hugely informative in terms of information provided by my member states, information that the individual members of the panel have validated, analysed and written up in terms of conclusions. So the fact that we don't have a North Korea panel anymore, I think, is very important in terms of the fact that states do not now have an impartial source of information about sanctions, circumvention activities. And of course on Iran, there was snapback on Iran back in September last year, there's supposed to be a process of agreeing a new panel, new Iran panel. I don't think that's going anywhere at the moment, so we haven't got an Iran panel. And that means that member states who have to implement these sanctions, they're obligatory, essentially being deprived of valuable information that enables them to do so. And the consequence of that, of course, is that sanctions aren't properly implemented, and sanctions are in place to do a specific job. In the case of Iran, it was to persuade Iran to abide by its IAEA commitments, non-proliferation treaty commitments. In the case of North Korea, it was the same. It was to persuade North Korea to come to the negotiating table and denuclearize. So the point, the objective of these sanctions, hugely important in terms of international peace and security. They're not being well implemented because member states don't have the information, because there are no panels. There are no panels because of the inability of the Security Council to come to an agreement.
Terrific start. And I want to transition to analyzing the efficacy of sanctions in each of these different cases, right? I think it's fair to say that both sanctions have struggled to achieve the ultimate objective, preventing breakout of one state and trying to get the other state to come back to the table and negotiate in good faith. And I think you could make one of two different conclusions on this basis. One is that sanctions as a tool are just ineffective. They just don't work. And then the other conclusion could be that sanctions could work if they were implemented properly, if they were bundled properly with the right diplomatic outreach, and that this just wasn't done, and that's why they didn't work. So when you kind of look at these two, and I guess we shouldn't write the epitaph on the sanctions just yet, because they just do the trick, and things work out. And how do you evaluate sanctions overall as this diplomatic tool?
Well, so sanctions are put in place by the Security Council as an alternative to military action, and that's quite an important point, I think. And if you don't think sanctions work, then what is going to work? So I think sanctions as a concept are important. But they need to be properly implemented, which means that the Security Council needs to be behind them. There needs to be committees in place that are actively managing them on a day-to-day basis. And there need to be panels of experts investigating how they're being circumvented. But I think when you look at Iran sanctions and North Korea sanctions, it is certainly the case, in my opinion, that Security Council sanctions on North Korea didn't work, haven't worked. But I think you can make the case that they contributed to a diplomatic solution of in the case of Iran, because in my opinion, I felt that the Security Council sanctions, they weren't bringing Iran to the negotiating table. What they were doing was slowing down its nuclear program. And there were some quite impressive interdictions that member states conducted.
This, of course, was before Iran broke out.
This was, so I'm going back to the period of the Iran panel. So 2010, 2016 it came to an end. At that time, there were member states were conducting interdictions of prohibited shipments, and these interdictions, in my opinion, were slowing down the program, and that was important. So Iran, there was grit in the system. Iran's program wasn't developing as they wanted it to. What brought Iran to the negotiating table and eventually resulted in an agreement of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was US financial sanctions, in my opinion, because Iran was having real problems buying things because states were not dealing with Iran, and any state that did deal with Iran and did so in dollars was being penalized by US authorities. And that was having a big impact on the Iranian economy, and so that's what brought agreement on the JCPOA. So I think you can make the case that sanctions did work, did have some effect in terms of Iran, even if they didn't and still haven't in terms of North Korea. So why didn't they in North Korea? Well, I'm not sure actually.
Well, you make some good arguments in this article here. So yeah, can you tell us about that?
Well, you can make various. You can speculate a little bit. I mean, I think one of the the sanctions are really quite complicated for member states to implement. You need to understand what's required. You then need to make sure that you've got the resources in place with the right sort of expertise. And most states, in my opinion, just don't have that. So sanctions tend not to be very effectively implemented, and I think that was probably an issue in the case of North Korea. Also, as I mentioned, the sanctions were placed on North Korea after it had detonated a device. So at that point, it had already put in place a lot of the structures it needed for its nuclear weapons program. And perhaps sanctions were just applied too late, really, to be effective in stopping it. There were other factors. North Korea has a shares a lengthy land border with China. There's a land border with Russia, and it wasn't always clear when I was on the North Korean panel just how effectively those two countries were had over the years implemented sanctions. And of course, since then we've seen Russia essentially walking away from sanctions. So I think those were the sorts of issues that meant that sanctions were less or ineffective on North Korea than they were on Iran.
Those are all really good points, I think. Just another thing that you mentioned here was that in the way, the timing of the North Korea sanctions, it wasn't just that they were too late. They were applied after North Korea really demonstrated the device. It's also that they were applied in layers, incrementally, over time, such that North Korea had the time, the wherewithal, the political capital to invest in the evasion techniques and procurement networks necessary over that long period of very gradual increase, ratcheting up of the sanctions pressure. So it kind of gave them an opportunity to set up the system that they needed to keep those procurement networks in place.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at the range of sanctions on North Korea, they're much more extensive than those that still exist, that were snapped back on Iran. And they extend in particular to North Korea's ability to raise funds. And so we're talking about the sanctions, the 4 or 5 rounds of sanctions that were applied to North Korea in 2016, 2017. They were focused on preventing states from buying commodities from North Korea, for example, coal, for example, steel, equipment, textiles, seafood, and the thinking was that almost any funds that North Korea was raising as a result of these sorts of sales could be used for its nuclear program, and therefore all these sorts of funds had to be stopped if possible. But I think in practice it's extremely difficult to do that. So I suspect that North Korea did find ways around these sanctions through alternative financial mechanisms other than just simply bank transfers.
Well, cyber has been just a jackpot for them. It's billions.
So cyber doesn't get mentioned in sanctions resolutions, but it is used as a way of raising funds, and the sanctions resolutions are focused on raising funds. And the cyber activity, I think, really started in 2017, 2018, and North Korea's proven to be very adept at hacking into hacking actually into a number of different banks and stealing fiat currencies virtually, but particularly adept at stealing cryptocurrencies, and some of the sums, billions of dollars have been stolen. But of course, it's so you do think, well, okay, billions of dollars worth of crypto. What do you do with it? Can you buy proliferation-sensitive equipment with crypto? I'm not sure, except that one of the organizations that has been set up in the aftermath of the disappearance of the North Korean panel is called the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, which is an organization that's set up by a number of European countries, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and they produce reports periodically on sanctions evasion by North Korea. They produced a report back in October on cryptocurrencies and fundraising by North Korea. And that report does contain some interesting examples of North Korea having used crypto or tried to use crypto to purchase items, conventional weapons perhaps rather than WMD related materials. But I think that's very significant, because if you are going to start using crypto to buy this stuff, then you don't have to borrow with, you don't have to bother, you don't have to worry about cashing it out. And the problem for the North Koreans, of course, was cashing out these vast amounts of crypto. And on that, there was an article in the Financial Times, I remember, back on the 2nd of January about Iran offering ballistic missiles and spare parts for crypto. That's very interesting if there are actually people buying crypto, using crypto to buy that material from Iran. And of course, the problem with crypto is very difficult to trace it. And most states, I think, just don't have the ability to trace it themselves. And if they employ a blockchain analytics company, which there are quite a few, like Chainalysis, for example, or TRM Labs, who produce regular reports on North Korea's use of crypto, they're quite expensive. And so crypto is an area that I think it's difficult for the average member state to deal with and control.
Thanks very much. Let's talk about the shifting geopolitical context, because things have moved quite a bit, especially in the post-COVID era. You've got Russia vetoing the extension of the mandate of a panel of experts, China increasing reluctance to actually implement sanctions on North Korea, and now there's this growing concern about an axis of sanctioned states. You've got growing military and technological cooperation between North Korea and Russia for sure, and perhaps Iran as well. So how do these changes speak to the effectiveness of international sanctions regimes? You've got all these bad boys in the bad boys club who are now playing quite nicely with one another.
Well, on the face of it, it's difficult perhaps to see an immediate future for Security Council sanctions, because you haven't got unanimity within the P5. But the sanctions that are in place remain in place, and they are obligatory on member states to implement. And I think the issue, therefore, is how do you provide a mechanism which substitutes for the North Korea panel, provides member states with the information they need to implement these sanctions. And I mentioned the multilateral sanctions monitoring team. That's one way of doing it. I mean, I personally think that more needs to be done in terms of providing guidance to member states on basic implementation of sanctions, and I'd like to see some sort of mechanism set up, perhaps based on an academic institution, that producing reports which, because it's an academic institution, would carry credibility as being impartial, objective reports. And if one could set up some sort of system, perhaps involving former panel members to put together such reports on a regular basis, I think that would be a very valuable thing to do. And I think that would be one way forward in terms of dealing with what at the moment is a difficult situation in terms of Security Council sanctions. I also think that there are other organisations that perhaps could be brought into play here. For example, the Financial Action Task Force, OECD organisation based in Paris, that has produced recommendations in the financial sphere which relate to proliferation financing, and there have been some good guidance documents published by the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force at the moment has recommendations, requirements in place which require states to conduct proliferation financing national risk assessments. That's important. And there is a current round of monitoring of these results. And I suspect that at the end of that round there will be some further cracking up of work by the Financial Action Task Force on proliferation financing. So you've got that. You've got the export control regimes as well, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime. I mean, these aren't sanctions oriented, but nevertheless they are involved in setting standards and requirements related to exports of proliferation sensitive material. And so more work needs to be done with those, I think. There's also, you have Resolution 1540, which is not a sanctions resolution, but it's a resolution that requires states to put in place legislation to prevent or control exports or transshipments, for example, of proliferation sensitive materials. And so, so although 1540 is not a sanctions resolution, and the 1540 committee is very careful to stay away of sanctions, nevertheless, there you have there a mechanism which can be used to promote some of the requirements of sanctions. And then you have other organisations like the World Customs Organization or the International Maritime Organization, which produce standards relating to exports and maritime security. All of those, I think, have roles to play, and if you haven't got some central UN Security Council sanctions body, maybe you can do some useful work in terms of promoting standards through those sorts of organizations.
Perfect. Well, you've opened the door to a discussion on proliferation finance, so let's walk through it. In your article, you say that there's three main processes to proliferation finance: the fundraising, disguising the funds, the procurement, and you say that this second stage of sneaking money into the international financial system can be the most challenging, but for a sanctioned state. So I want to ask about North Korea versus Iran's tactics for actually
Iran, I mean, we're looking at now at countries at slightly different stages. So the process. So Iran, when I was working on the Iran panel, Iran was very effective at making use of the international banking system. There are a number of Iranian businesses that went off all banks in countries in the Caucasus, for example, or the Middle East, and so Iran was moving money through these banks, using money transfer businesses to move money around, and also there was a lot of movement of money using cash couriers. And I think North Korea went through similar stages, but it's moved on, particularly with its development of cryptocurrencies as a way of raising and moving funds, and been very effective at that. I just haven't seen that so far in Iran. I mean, one sees references to Iranian organizations using cryptocurrencies, but I'm not aware of the sort of intensive focus on hacking that you see in North Korea. And I think those are the two main differences at the moment. But I'm sure if Iran comes under significant financial pressure in the future, then it will look to North Korea as a source of expertise on hacking of cryptocurrencies.
So you've argued that the international framework to counter proliferation finance is pretty weak, and many financial institutions rely on a simple checklist screening. What more needs to be done to help these banks, the shipping companies, and the tech firms identify some of the more complicated strategies that countries like North Korea and Iran employ?
Well, I think I mentioned the Financial Action Task Force earlier on. I think that's done some very good work in this respect. Has published guidance documents on sanctions, financial sanctions evasion. The formal requirements of the Financial Action Task Force are very narrowly focused on targeted Security Council targeted financial sanctions. I don't think it's very helpful. Actually, it'd be much better if the recommendations were expanded to include other types of financial sanctions. But that said, the Financial Action Task Force has published guidance documents encouraging states to look more widely than targeted financial sanctions. There was a very good document published back in June, Complex Proliferation Finance and Sanctions Evasion Schemes, which contain the 40 or 50 case studies, which I think are very interesting in terms of illustrating the range of proliferation finance and financial sanctions evasion. And even if those aren't part of the Financial Action Task Force standards, many countries are looking more widely at proliferation finance because of what the Financial Action Task Force is doing. So that's one area that would be good. I mentioned Resolution 1540, the proliferation financing requirements of that. The 1540 committee at the moment is not particularly active in terms of promoting those requirements, but I think that's another area that the Financial Action Task Force could look at. The guidance on 1540 would be very, very useful. I also think that member states can do more in terms of their outreach to the private sector. There are a number of countries with very active banking associations in this area. And for example, in the UK, there is an organisation called UK Finance, which published last year a very good guidance document on proliferation finance. And So that's an example of the banking community sort of taking its own initiative. And one of the important aspects of proliferation financing, I think, is that we're talking about an activity here which is potentially significantly destabilizing in terms of regional peace and security. Most commercial organizations don't like working where there's destabilization. Most want to feel that they're on the right side. Most want to feel that they're doing work which is promoting international peace and security. And I think that national authorities could perhaps do more to bring the private sector on side in those terms than they do. And this document by UK Finance, I think, was a very good example of the private sector moving in the right direction in that respect. And then you have you have the academic sector, you have think tanks, and connected with King's College London, and we set up 10 years ago a project called Project Alpha, which was intended to sort of sit between government and the private sector and act as a channel of communication between the two, to support government in terms of government's requirements on weapons of mass destruction, sanctions implementation, and to support the private sector in terms of providing training and support on compliance issues, for example. And I think that there are other such organizations in existence in Washington, for example, in Paris. But the private sector, I think the academic sector could be more engaged on this subject, and that's another area that would help, I think.
Terrific. A lot of good roadmaps for helping us out in the future. One thing that sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, largely depend on is the dominance of the U.S. dollar. And we've seen an interest in certain states, many of them subject to U.S. sanctions, switching to systems that are dollar alternatives. So I wanted to ask about how effective you think this strategy could be and what impact it would have overall on sanctions.
Well, so I'm not a dollar expert, I'm afraid. But my impression is that this concern by U.S. authorities that perhaps the dollar's going to lose its leverage has been around for some time. And it's certainly the case that countries such as Russia and China have tried to develop their own systems for financial messaging or for moving money around that are independent of the US or Western systems. And at the moment we have a system called SWIFT, which is based in Belgium, which is a system of sending messages around between banks. It's a global system, and that's very, very widely used. And then underlying that is a system of moving dollars around. There's something called the clearinghouse interbank payment system, for example. China has tried to set up an alternative to the clearinghouse interbank payment system. It's called the what's it called?
Not sure. You can pin it in comment.
I can't remember, I'm afraid. Cross-border interbank payment system, and so they're using that to move renminbi around in a way which is completely independent of any dollar system. And And the concern is that over time, more and more countries may start moving this cross-border, they may start using this cross-border interbank payment system. But when you look at the figures, I think well over 60% of international trade payments are made in dollars, perhaps 30% are made in euros, but the renminbi still accounts for less than 60% of by volume of total payments. So it's still very, very small, and I think therefore that it's going to be many, many years before China, for example, manages to get into a situation where there's sufficient money, sufficient renminbi flowing around the financial system that it has that will represent a significant competitor to the dollar in terms of the way that international trade is paid for. And while that's still the case, the dollar is going to be used for international trade in the US, will still have control of the dollar. So I think this is an issue, but it's a very, very long-term issue.
I read an interesting article by Olivia Vasilati. So she argued that Russia is learning from North Korea's maritime invasion playbook, but they have over 1,000 shadow tankers and much higher integration into the global economy. So she describes how both countries, North Korea and Russia, exploit the decentralized nature of global shipping registries to disguise the ownership of their ships through false flagging. She says that sanctioning individual vessels will never solve the ultimate cat and mouse game, and that the ultimate solution lies in secondary sanctions targeting the financial and corporate life support systems of the registries. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, this is an issue. The panel, North Korean panel reports over the years have included recommendations for due diligence by registries. The most recent substantive sanctions resolution on North Korea, which was Resolution 2397 of 2017, included as part of one of the operative paragraphs requirements for deregistration of vessels that have been involved in sanctions evasion. And I suspect that at that time there was probably a discussion about, well, perhaps we should actually sanction some of these registries ourselves. I don't know. But I suspect as well, if you sanction the registry, the issue is, okay, so you'll have, you'll be able to get at North Korean vessels or Iranian vessels, but you will impact an awful lot of other vessels as well. So the sort of wider impacts would be very serious indeed. And I suspect that's why there hasn't been sanctions on registries.
And presumably these registries are not making a mistake of ill will, but rather just lack of capacity.
Well, actually, it's partly lack of capacity. Some of these registries are pretty virtual, actually, and some of them are run by private companies. And so there is an issue, I think, of small countries looking at registries as being a way of earning income, and they employ some company to run it for them, and they have to rely on that company to do the right thing. And I'm sure that doesn't always happen. But I would say there's another point, actually, that the International Maritime Organization has been looking at this issue of registry compliance, and there are some guidelines agreed in April, actually, for registry transparency and due diligence. Those are guidelines, they're not obligatory, but nevertheless, that is an indication that this is an issue that a lot of people are aware of.
Yeah. So my last question is about what does the future hold? And for sanctions on North Korea, for sanctions on Iran, for sanctions on the diplomatic tool in and of themselves, and I'm sure the answer that you've written down has now been changed by the news of just about a couple hours ago, so sorry for that forceful adaptation, but just curious, what do you think is coming down the road?
Well, I mean, let's say Iran sanctions stay in place, Security Council sanctions, then I suspect that countries will be thinking of a multilateral sanctions monitoring mechanism for that, in parallel with North Korea. What I would like to see is some sort of monitoring mechanism based in a university, perhaps involving former panel members who would produce reports focused on the range of sanctions requirements with guidance for individual member states on implementation of good practices. I think that's what member states need to better implement sanctions. So I think that's one thing. Otherwise, and in addition, I think the issue is building communities of interest. There are a number of countries that regularly issue unilateral sanctions, the US, for example. You have EU sanctions, Canada, UK, Japan are okay. They produce unilateral sanctions, and these countries need to coordinate, I think. I've touched before on the issue of outreach by states to the private sector. Technical briefings are important. Use of the academic and think tank sector is important. I mentioned the Financial Action Task Force. There are a number of levers that can be pulled here. None of them is going to effectively substitute for the Security Council sanctions, but nevertheless, used individually on a collective basis, they will have some impact. So I think that's important.
Terrific. Well, I've learned so much today, and so grateful for your time, Dr. Jonathan Brewer. And so, as a special treat for our guests here in person, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions directly. Just an incentive for you guys to show up in person. We've got hundreds of people watching online, so they'll have the opportunity to come in person next time. Please join us back July 23rd. We'll be doing a commemorative reception to mark the anniversary of the Korean War armistice. We'll have at least one Korean War veteran come in person, and that's in partnership with our wonderful friends at KTVA, including General Chris Stockwell, who's in the audience today. So thanks for joining us, Chris. Thank you to my colleague Chelsea, my colleague Peter, who's doing the production, our wonderful intern Julian, and thank you so much for our audience who came in person today. Please stick around and get a chance to ask a question directly to Dr. Jonathan Brewer. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Great job. I learned a ton. Thank you so much. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come on up and come right to the podium and just state your name and ask your question.